Good morning and welcome back on this Sunday morning to a class on Tristram Shandy. Now, Snigdha has put two questions before me and try and answer them before I move on to the next segment where I'll discuss issues of time, punctuation, and the idea of the book. Now, Snigdha, the first question that she's asked me is, what is the meaning of opinion in the very title of this novel denoting? Now, obviously, this uses a certain amount of element of what is called Menippean satire, and uh, therefore exists at a cross between the novel, the biography, and the first person ideas on various subjects. Therefore, on time, for example, on society, for example, on sentiment, for example. Therefore, the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy denotes first person intimate sort of exploration into character that is highlighted. So, but importantly, it denotes very very concisely, to be precise, the idea of the autobiography, where the autobiography is not only the life history of an individual told in the first person, but also many of his ideas which are articulated. Now, the other question that Snigdha has asked is, since there's no unification of sensibility between Stern's plot and character, again, unification of sensibility is a term that you use with reference to the metaphysicals. I don't think really there is any unification here. Stern is the only unification here is in the defamiliarization. You see, defamiliarization or ostraniny, as I pointed out, is a device used or suggested by the Russian formalists, where you sort of graphically or you theoretically put forward certain devices that are very often used in the novel and make them strange. So, in this certain case, how is the plot made strange? I would say by showing how the plot is built up of certain conventions. Stern is defamiliarizing the plot. Stern is defamiliarizing character in the same way. Therefore, the only unification of the novel, really, the point of unity of the novel, is in this process of defamiliarization. And role playing in this novel enters our culture and reality. Uh, it's true, again, you see, in the postmodern era, what you project or what you kind of sort of put out on the social media, for example, is constructed as your reality, which might be very different. Even your photograph is morphed, your identity can be morphed. So Stern is trying to just show us how within these novels or within the autobiography, only a certain kind of projection is made, and that is made by the author. So authorial art is more important in this novel than any kind of real portrayal of uh, Tristram Shandy as such. Stern says there's no real Tristram Shandy at all. It is only the projection that one makes. Similarly, in your autobiography, you might select incidents and you might portray yourself as good. Everybody does that. Whereas, the ultimate reality might be different. What Stern is again pointing out is that in art, there is only art. The referentiality of art to reality is extremely tenuous and nebulous. That is what Stern is trying to point out. And that is something which is very applicable to our reality as well. Because that reality, as John Fowles points out, we are in escape from reality with ourselves. So, uh, the reality that you put out, not only to the world, but to yourself, might be very different from what you really are. So, we are forever playing a certain role. And this role playing is therefore endemic within our society and culture. Right, having made those points, now let me try and project my PowerPoint so that I can move on to the issue of the uh, the issue of time and character and time and the book and punctuation. So I will, of course, go to the current slide. And the challenge to time, as I pointed out in one of my earlier discussions, draws upon this Bergsonian idea of Dury, although Bergson was to theorize this later on. But the idea of duration as to how, time matters, different intervals of time matter in different degrees. That Stern is highlighting, one. So Stern is questioning this idea of linear time being broken up into equal intervals. That is the first point. Secondly, he's suggesting that, in narrative, this ordering of time into sequences is also something that the author is doing. And that is one of the more important aspects of the realist novel, in the way in which there is a linear narrative or there is a circular narrative. There's a definite pattern of organizing narrative in terms of time. Stern, by making time entirely random, by violating time, by defamiliarizing time, is actually drawing attention to the way in which narrative constructs time. Therefore, this is again a pattern of defamiliarization to the notion of time. His narrative, therefore, moves backwards and forwards. He's continuously disrupting the forward flow of narrative. Just as the plot is continuously digressing, the narrative is randomly moving forwards and backwards, therefore, showing you at every time how, while reading a novel, you are forced to assume certain qualities of time in narrative, right? Say, for example, if you're reading a detective story and you come to the almost the end of the novel, and suddenly the writer says, "Oh, hello, let us go back in time. I've forgotten an important clue," and that clue alters the entire segment of the narrative. Then your expectations of the narrative logic will be disrupted. So, by challenging this narrative logic, Stern is defamiliarizing time. So, there's an obsessive concern with time, in the sense that time is inseparable from the self and from the ontological process of writing. And this ontological process of writing, of how consciousness is being created, becomes important. So the self is always rooted in time. And Tristram, because he's unable to cope with handling this time, shows how, time becomes important for the construction of the self. And when the self itself is shown to be artificial, or something that is being continuously modeled, then this question of time becomes significant. So the greatest example of this is Walter Shandy. Walter Shandy wants to write a work of or a philosophical treatise called Tristopedia, where every second of Tristram's life will be recorded in prose as he is growing up. So there is an assumption that narrative can narrativize every moment of our time, it can record it. But Stern shows how this is not possible, how Tristram grows up much, much faster than what Walter can write. Therefore, Walter can only select. Similarly, all our narratives are not real, because reality is vast, and in a particular narrative, we only choose certain moments. Now, again, this very concept of time and its relevance is questioned in a passage which is almost surreal, where, reality and nightmare, reality and, past, present, future kind of come into a fusion. So Stern says, "Time wastes too fast. Every letter I trace thee with tells me with what rapidity life follows my pen, are flying over our heads like light clouds of a windy day, never to return more. Whilst thou art twisting that lock, see, it turns grey. So, in that sense, narrative can play around with time. Narrative always, is an artificial record of time. That is what Stern is trying to suggest. Now, what I was trying to point out with Bergson is that Bergson suggests that chronological time is uniform, right? And that it is broken into seconds and minutes that form an undifferentiated matrix. But for Stern, certain novels certain novels seem to be stretched because of their importance in the narrative. For example, as Walter and Toby wait for Tristram's birth, the narrator records the exact chronological duration, 2 hours and 10 minutes. Yet for them, it seems an age. Again, time stops in Tristram Shandy when Walter's foot hovers over a step, while the story meanders and comes down only after the digression has been completed. So, once again, Stern is highlighting how it is the narrator who handles time rather than the narrative being an exact replication of the time progressed. So there, Stern is pointing out always to the concept of narrative time. You see, suggesting that every work of art is artificial, manufactured by the author, and that author can handle time in his own way rather than the narrative being an exact history, which is a record of time, right? Now, the other thing that Stern does to show that this is a work of art and not reality is persistently refer to intertextuality. Now, intertextuality is this discourse between different texts. And in doing so, Stern is drawing attention to Tristram Shandy as a text rather than as life. Right? So it is not the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy, but it is the life of opinions of Tristram Shandy as written by Stern. Right? So Stern himself called Tristram Shandy a book of books. And part of his imitative play is to draw upon earlier texts in order to expose narrative conventions. So he shows how narratives are born out of narratives, they are not born out of life. So the first tradition that he draws is the tradition of learned wit, which he borrows from quite a number of sources, but most importantly, Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel, Burton Anatomy of Melancholy, where learning is piled on learning, as it were. In Walter Shandy, Stern uses the Rabelaisian parody of the Philosophus Gloriosus, who randomly displays his pedantry. Right. So once again, as I said, hobby horse, showing off his intellectual prowess, which is often pedantic and false, is Walter Shandy's speciality. Then, of course, he's also drawing upon not only Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel, but he's also drawing upon Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy and Erasmus's Praise of Folly. Again, in the hobby horse, he's drawing upon this idea from Erasmus. And in these parodic moments, he's also referring to, Cervantes and in the way in which this mock heroic is used in Cervantes periodically. So acknowledges that Yoric's character comes from the honest refinements of the peerless knight of La Mancha, and the real quixotic protagonist in Tristram Shandy is Uncle Toby. So all throughout Tristram Shandy, there are echoes of other texts. And in bringing these echoes of other texts into the foreground, Stern is showing that this is not a piece of life. It's a book. It's a piece of art, which is again derived from certain conventions of other art objects. So Stern is defamiliarizing the text as not actually life. It is a piece of art. So in all these, The realist novel in Tom Jones had tried to suggest, at least in its major narrative, not the prefatory narratives, that this was a piece of life. That this is how time moves, this is how the plot moves, this is how resolutions, openings, endings are achieved. Stern says, look at these features. He's thrusting time in our face, thrusting plot in our face, thrusting character in our face, telling us to observe them closely, and in doing so is exposing the artifice within the novel rather than it being a history or a life. Now, the one thing that Stern does, and this is particularly crucial for any discussion of metafiction, is the way in which Stern is looking at the page, the book, and the physical, mood of print. See, how does a word make meaning? As Claude Lévi-Strauss points out, really, that words are merely reference. They are signifiers to a certain signified. And these words are planted on the page of a book. So if Stern can show the word as the word and not reality, then, and the book as the book and not reality, by defamiliarizing language, punctuation, and pagination, then the artifice of the book, as it were, or the art of defamiliarization is further, as it were, highlighted. The art of defamiliarization, therefore, is also to be implemented through this element of language, print, punctuation, pagination. Let us take a look at how this happens. For example, Stern is using this dash, the punctuation. Out of punctuation, you have commas, full stops, asterisks, and so on. Now, it sort of, the dash, in a very intense, dramatic moment, by repeated usage, can actually make this moment parodic, can show it how Stern, the author, is constructing it rather than, it being a interior monologue of a person. So, you shall see the very place, madam, said my uncle Toby. Widow Wadman blushed, dash, looked at the door, dash, turned pale, dash, blushed slightly again, dash, recovered her natural color, dash, blushed worse than ever, dash, Lord, I cannot look at it, dash, what would the world say if I looked at it, dash, I should drop down if I looked at it, dash, and so on and so forth. So what is a very dramatic, sort of, you argue that Stern is trying to visualize the conflict that is going on within Widow of dashes. What Stern does is he parodies this, and he shows how the author is constructing this mock heroic moment rather than this being a slice of reality. Now, you can see, for example, the dash used in the book proper. That is why I've taken this picture, and you can see how the dash is being used to always, sort of highlight this mock heroic. Take an example of this digression in Lafever's death. And Lafever's death, you see, the moment of death, which should have been an extremely sentimental moment, becomes comic, parodic. Nature instantly ebbed again, dash, the film returned to its place, dash, the pulse fluttered, dash, stopped, dash, went on, dash, throbbed, dash moved again dash moved dash stopped dash shall I go on dash no. So what was, the moment of death, that then becomes a kind of a constructed set piece by the narrator, and the dash punctuation helps him to foreground this artificiality of the narrative rather than the reality it depicts, right? So it is the prerogative of the writer to reconstruct this narrative, to stop this narrative, and therefore he thrusts this art right in your face to tell you how the work is created, right? And you can see once again in the manuscript of Sterne how the dash is used. Now, the other thing that Sterne does is use the asterisk, right? So, he uses this from Swift, actually. And the asterisk, what it does is it brings multiple meanings into play, right? So that, it is incomplete. And as I pointed out in the metafictional text, it is the writerly text of Barthes. Barthes, that is Roland Barthes, in S by Z, suggests that there are two kinds of texts. One is the readerly text, which is meant only for consumption, the literary thriller, detective story, for example. And the other, where the author is inviting the reader to fill in certain details, to imaginatively incorporate certain details. And Sterne, by putting the asterisk in, is bringing multiple, the reader to make an interpretation of the text. So it's drawing him into the process of writing, right? Now, very often the Victorians suggested that, in putting the asterisk where there were sexual passages, it was a new way of talking body. But Sterne is suggesting that, language can construct multiple meanings. There's one reality, right? But language can construct multiple realities, and he's therefore showing the difference between the artifice and the reality. If there's one reality, then in the language creation of reality, there can be alternative realities as well. Right. Word challenge to the book. Now, what do we presume when we read a text? When we read a text, we presume we are reading history. We are reading what is real in the realist fiction. That when somebody is writing his biography, it is exactly the way that happened. But what are we reading actually? We are reading black words on a white page. We are reading a book, which is an artificial version. It is not reality. But we very often do not take it for granted. We actually read through as if the page is a lens through which we can see reality. What Sterne does is it defamiliarizes this book as a physical book, and therefore points out that it is artificial. It is a work of art. And therefore, in the plot of Tom Jones' Tristram Shandy, for example, you see, when he's talking about Yorick's death and the description of that moment, he does not use words, he uses a black page to convey that words cannot convey the finality of death. Yet in bringing this black page, what has he done? He has shown you how the book functions, how language is artificial, how the printed word is artificial and not life. Similarly, for example, when he's sort of using the kind of description of the book, is using marble pages. And every marble page in that time, in Stern's time, every marble page, because of these ways of printing, was slightly different. So Stern is showing how every single copy of the book is different from the other, and therefore every reader is reading a different version of Tristram Shandy. So the life of opinions is not one life, it is multiple lives, as it were. So you can see, if this is one marble page of one particular edition, this would have been another marble page of another edition. So Stern is drawing attention to the reader that he's reading a book, he's not reading life. It is not life. So together, what I'm saying is Stern is engaging in a process of continuous defamiliarization. Now, the word defamiliarization or ostraniny, as I point out, was used by the Russian formalists, most importantly Viktor Shklovsky, when he referred to the literary work as making strange, right? So the conventions which we generally take for granted, Viktor Shklovsky says that the writer can make them strange, can point these conventions to us, can highlight and foreground these conventions so that we understand the artificiality of the work. Stern is foregrounding the conventions of how plot is created, how openings and beginnings take place, how digressions can take place. He's making it forwards and backwards to show how the author is actually constructing the plot. He is referring to character and the creation of hobby horses and showing the artificiality of character to reality. Finally, he's also showing the artificiality of handling of time, that in real life time and narrative time are always different. He's also showing how the book is a book and is not reality, how language can never capture reality and there will always be gaps and slippages. And very often, by periodically using punctuation, is showing how the author is constructing the moment rather than it being just a visualization of history. So Stern's art in the novel is a continuous art of defamiliarization, of making strange, so that Stern can point out the conventions through which the novel is being written. Right? That is what is Stern's art. But then, what does the novel mean? Is this just a meaningless display of your own caliber? Is this just to throw everything into chaos? Or does Stern really want to make a philosophical point through this art of defamiliarization? Now, in my last class on Tristram Shandy, which will be tomorrow at 10:30 a.m., what I will discuss is, what does the novel want to do? What is the point of this metafictional, defamiliarizational style in Tristram Shandy? Is he trying to arrive at any philosophical position? Or is he merely trying to show that this is a work of art and nothing else? This then will be my agenda for my next class. For now, I'll stop sharing and allow you to sort of move into and enjoy your Sunday, really. But tomorrow's class, remember, becomes the final class of Tristram Shandy, where I will conclude with the intentions of Stern within the novel. Right. So I hope to see you tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. again. Till then, it's goodbye and thank you for joining.